Maria Santos had left the Chicago Fire Department 3 years ago, carrying scars no one could see. That May morning, wearing a simple navy blue dress and comfortable flats, she was there simply as a mother. Her son Daniel would graduate from high school in 2 hours, and nothing else mattered besides this moment she had waited for since he was born 18 years ago. The school gymnasium was beginning to fill up when Maria found her seat in the bleachers. Entire families arrived carrying signs, flowers, and cameras. The mid-morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the stage where the diplomas would be awarded. Maria adjusted the strap of her bag and watched the final preparations, feeling a mixture of pride and melancholy. Daniel would be the first in the family to go to university. He had won a full scholarship to study engineering. While she waited, Maria unconsciously tugged at the long sleeve of her dress, an automatic gesture that had become part of her. Beneath the fabric, on the inside of her left forearm, was tattooed the emblem of the Chicago Fire Department, an eagle with outstretched wings on a red sheet, accompanied by the dates of her service. It was a tattoo she had gotten after completing 10 years in the department, a symbol of pride and belonging that now seemed to belong to another life. The sound of chairs being dragged brought her back to the present. More people were arriving, and the murmur of lively conversations filled the space. Maria recognized some of Daniel's classmates' parents, nodded discreetly, and turned her attention back to the printed program she had received at the entrance. Her son's name was there, listed among the 100 graduating students in the class. Daniel Marcus Santos. She ran her fingers over the printed letters, remembering the day she had first taken him to school, a small boy with a backpack bigger than himself. It was then that the gym's sound system emitted a high-pitched hiss, followed by a voice calling for attention. Maria looked up, expecting to see the school principal, but instead saw a man in a firefighter's uniform quickly climbing onto the stage. Her heart raced instantly, a conditioned reflex from years of service. Something was wrong. The fire captain, a man of about 45 with graying hair at the temple, picked up the microphone and spoke in a calm but firm voice that Maria immediately recognized. It was the tone used to avoid panic while communicating a real emergency. He informed them that smoke had been detected in the building's basement, that the alarm system would be activated shortly, and that everyone should evacuate the gymnasium in an orderly fashion using the marked exits. Before he finished speaking, the alarm began to sound. The shrill sound filled the space, and Maria felt her body react even before her mind had fully processed the situation. She stood there, assessing the exits, counting how many people were between her position and the nearest door, noting where the elderly and young children who needed assistance were located. People began to move, some too hurried, others hesitant. Maria saw an elderly woman struggling to descend the bleachers, a crying child separated from its parents, a man in a wheelchair blocked by people trying to pass. Her training took over. She quickly descended to the elderly woman, offered her firm arm, and guided her safely. Then she ran to the child, knelt at her level, spoke calmly until she pointed to where her parents were, and led her to them. Then she helped clear a path for the man in the wheelchair. The fire captain had come down from the stage and was coordinating the evacuation when he noticed Maria. He watched for a moment, how she moved with purpose and efficiency, how her instructions were followed without question, how she remained calm while helping person after person. There was something deeply familiar about the way she worked. As Maria walked past him, guiding a small group of confused people toward the side exit, the captain followed her with his eyes. That's when he saw it. For just a second, as Maria raised her arm to point in the right direction, the sleeve of her dress rode up, revealing the edge of the tattoo, the unmistakable eagle, the red shield, the emblem of Chicago. The captain froze in place, his eyes fixed on that partial image. He knew that tattoo. More than that, he knew what it meant. Only members of the Chicago Fire Department, who had served with distinction for at least 10 years, were entitled to wear that specific emblem. And there was something else, something in that woman's posture, in the way she moved, that stirred a distant memory. The evacuation continued around him, but Captain James Morrison remained standing, processing what he had seen. His team was dealing with the situation underground, controlling what turned out to be an electric system problem that had caused overheating and smoke. There was no real fire, just enough dense smoke to trigger the detector. But that woman, that tattoo, now occupied all his attention. Outside the gymnasium, in the parking lot where hundreds of people had gathered, Maria searched for Daniel. She found him among a group of graduating students, all still wearing their blue gowns and holding their caps. Daniel ran to her as soon as he saw her. He was worried, asking if she was all right, if she had been hurt in the evacuation. Maria smiled and hugged her son, assuring him that everything was fine. She didn't mention how her heart was still racing, not from the danger, but from the adrenaline rush of being back in action, even if only helping with the evacuation. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in 3 years, since leaving the fire department. Captain Morrison left the building 10 minutes later, spoke briefly with the school principal, and then began to circulate among the assembled people. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for the woman in the navy blue dress. When he finally found her, she was standing next to a young graduate, talking with other parents. He approached with determined steps. Maria felt someone stop beside her and turned around. The fire captain was there, looking directly at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. There was recognition in his eyes, but also confusion and something that seemed urgent. The captain wasted no time with preambles. He said he'd noticed her tattoo and asked if she'd served in Chicago. Maria hesitated, her hand instinctively covering her forearm even over the fabric of her dress. She confirmed briefly, yes, she had been a firefighter in Chicago. The captain nodded slowly and then said something that made Maria's world stop for a moment. He asked if she was Maria Santos, the same Maria Santos who had been present at the warehouse fire on Franklin Street 3 years ago. The same Maria Santos who had been one of the last people to leave the building before it collapsed. Maria stood completely still. No one had spoken to her about that day in 3 years. Her son, beside her, noticed the change in her expression and touched her arm with concern, but she barely registered the gesture. Her eyes were fixed on the captain, and she knew exactly why he was asking those questions. Captain Morrison continued, his voice low now, almost private despite being in the middle of the crowd. He said he had been the incident commander that day, that he had given the evacuation order. He said he had reviewed that fire 1,000 times in his mind, questioning every decision, every moment of delay. And then he said the thing Maria least expected to hear. He said there was always an unanswered question about that day, a question about a person several survivors mentioned seeing helping others escape, a woman who kept going back inside the building even after the evacuation order, a woman who was never officially identified in the reports. Because she left the department before the investigation was completed, Maria felt her chest tighten. Daniel was asking what was happening. Others around were beginning to notice the intense conversation, but she couldn't take her eyes off the... She had left Chicago a week after that fire, moved to that small town, started a new life working in an office, doing everything she could to forget. Captain Morrison then asked the question directly. He asked if it had been her, if Maria had been the person the survivors described, the woman who went back inside the burning building 3 times, the woman who guided 8 people to safety, the woman whose actions likely saved lives but were never officially acknowledged. The silence between them lasted only seconds, but it seemed to stretch on indefinitely. Maria could feel the weight of years of silence, of unprocessed trauma, of unanswered questions. She had left Chicago because she could no longer be near that job. Those memories. The fire on Franklin Street hadn't been just another call. It had been the culmination of 10 years seeing things that change a person. Losing colleagues, carrying the weight of each life she couldn't save along with the one. Finally, Maria answered. Her voice was low, controlled, but there was an emotion in her that she couldn't complete. She confirmed it. Yes, it had been her. But she hadn't done anything more than any other firefighter would have done. It hadn't been heroism, just instinct and training. Captain Morrison shook his head slowly. He said it wasn't quite like that. Reports indicated that the building was extremely unstable, that the evacuation order had been given in advance precisely because the structure was compromised. Going back inside under those conditions wasn't standard protocol. It was a personal choice, one that few would have made. Maria didn't know what to say. She had spent 3 years trying not to think about that day, trying to build a life where she didn't have to choose between her own safety and that of strangers. A life where she could simply be a mother watching her son graduate, not a firefighter calculating risks and rescue possibilities. Daniel, who had remained quiet beside his mother, finally spoke. He asked what was happening, why that man was talking to his mother about fires. Maria turned to him, saw the confusion and worry on his face. She realized she had never told him the details of that last day in Chicago. She had never really explained why they had moved so abruptly, why she had left a job she loved. Before Maria could respond, Captain Morrison addressed Daniel. He formally introduced himself and then told the young man that his mother was one of the bravest people he had ever met, that her actions 3 years ago had saved lives, even though she had never received official recognition for them. Daniel looked from Morrison to his mother, processing this new information. Maria saw the questions forming in his eyes, but before he could ask them, an announcement was made over the portable sound system they had set up in the parking lot. The building had been declared safe. The graduation ceremony would be postponed for an hour to allow everything to be rearranged, but it would still take place that day. People around began to disperse, some returning to their cars to wait, others remaining in groups talking about this. Captain Morrison told Maria that they needed to talk more, but that this was neither the time nor the place. He took a card from his pocket and handed it to her, asking her to call him. Maria took the card, feeling the weight of the thin paper between her fingers, as if it were much heavier than it actually was. The captain turned to leave, but stopped and looked at her once more. He said there was something else she needed to know, something about that day that he had only recently discovered. Maria waited, her heart racing again. Morrison said that one of the men she had helped out of the building that day was the father of a family of 5. He had gone home that night. He had seen his youngest daughter turn 3. He had walked his eldest daughter down the aisle last month. All because someone had gone back inside a burning building when they didn't need to, when it wasn't safe, when it would have been easier to simply leave and let fate decide. The words hit Maria with physical force. She had spent 3 years focusing on the weight of the lives lost, the people she hadn't been able to save, the colleagues who hadn't returned home. She had never really stopped to think about the lives that continued, the stories that unfolded because she and others like her made impossible choices at impossible times. Morrison then walked away, leaving Maria and Daniel alone in the dispersing crowd. Daniel waited a moment before speaking, giving his mother time to process. Then he gently asked why she had never told him about it. Maria took her time to answer. She looked at her son, now a man, about to embark on his own adventure in life. How could she explain that there were days when she woke up and still felt the heat of those flames, still heard the scream, still carried the weight of decisions made in fractions of a second? How could she explain that leaving Chicago hadn't been giving up, but rather an attempt at survival, to remain whole enough to continue being the mother he needed? She told him that some things were difficult to talk about, that some experiences changed a person in ways that took time to understand. She said she had left the fire department because she needed to, because she could no longer separate the work from the person she was, because she was losing herself in the process. Daniel hugged his mother there in the parking lot, and Maria allowed herself to be vulnerable for a moment, allowing tears she hadn't shed in 3 years to finally fall. They weren't tears of weakness or regret. They were tears of liberation, of recognition, of finally allowing that chapter of her life to be acknowledged, even if only by herself and her son. When they finally parted, Maria wiped her face and smiled. She told Daniel that today was his day, his graduation, his celebration. All of that could wait. They would go back inside, watch the ceremony, take 1,000 photos, and celebrate properly. Daniel agreed, but as they walked back to the gym, he held his mother's hand in a way he hadn't done since he was little. He said he was proud of her, not just for what she had done as a firefighter, but for having had the courage to leave when she needed to rebuild a life, to be there for him even when he knew now that she carried so much unspoken weight. The graduation ceremony went as planned, only an hour late. Maria sat in the stands and watched her son walk across the stage, receive his diploma, and turn his cap around. She applauded and shouted his name like any proud mother would. But something had changed in her during that last hour. A door she had kept firmly closed had been opened just a crack, and light was beginning to stream in. That night, after all the parties and celebrations were over, after Daniel had gone to bed, Maria sat alone in her living room and looked at the card Captain Morrison had given her. She knew that calling him would mean reopening a chapter she had tried to close. It would mean confronting memories she had tried to bury. But perhaps, she thought, closing a chapter properly didn't mean locking it up and throwing away the key. Perhaps it meant reading it completely, understanding its place in the bigger story, and then moving on with the lesson learned instead of the wound still open. Maria picked up her phone and dialed the card number. She didn't call yet, but she saved the contact. It would be a start. Tomorrow, or maybe next week, when she was ready, she would call. She would listen to what Morrison had to say. And maybe, just maybe, she would begin the process of truly making peace with who she had been and who she had chosen to become. The tattoo on her arm didn't have to be a reminder of pain. It could simply be a mark of a chapter lived fully, of genuine service given, of a life that mattered even when it was too difficult to continue living that way. Maria woke up the next day with a strange feeling of lightness mixed with anxiety. The house was silent. Daniel was still asleep after the long night of celebrations with his friends. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, observing Morrison's card that she had left there the night before. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the printed letters with his name and barracks number. She picked up the phone several times that morning, dialed the numbers, but always hung up before completing the call. It wasn't exactly fear, but a deep hesitation about what that conversation might trigger. For 3 years, Maria had carefully built a routine that kept her stable. She worked in the administrative department of a logistics company, a quiet job that never required her to make life or death decisions. She went to the supermarket, cooked dinners, helped Daniel with his homework, watched movies on weekends. It was an ordinary, predictable, safe life. But yesterday, for a few minutes during that evacuation, she had felt something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Absolute clarity. Her instincts had taken over, and she had moved with a certainty that was lacking in almost every other aspect of her current life. It was both comforting and unsettling to realize that that part of her still existed, just dormant, not dead. Daniel appeared in the kitchen around noon, still sleepy, grabbed some juice from the refrigerator, and sat down across from his mother. He didn't immediately mention the conversation from the previous day, but Maria could see the questions in his eyes. Finally, after a few minutes of comfortable silence, he asked if she was all right, if meeting that captain had affected her. Maria considered her words carefully. She said, yes, it had affected her, but not necessarily in a bad way. She explained that leaving Chicago had been necessary at that moment, but that perhaps she had never deprocessed what she had experienced, only run away from it. Daniel listened attentively and then asked a question that surprised Maria. He asked if she had been happy as a firefighter before that last fire. The question caught her off guard because no one had ever asked it before. When she left the corporation, everyone assumed it was because the work had become too demanding, too dangerous, too traumatic. And all of that is true. But no one had asked about the 10 years before that last day. No one had asked about the hundreds of calls where she made a difference, about the camaraderie with her team, about the profound satisfaction of knowing that her work mattered in tangible and immediate ways. Maria realized she was smiling as she answered. Yes, she had been happy. She had loved that job with an intensity she had never experienced anywhere else. She had loved the adrenaline, yes, but also the discipline, the teamwork, the feeling of belonging to something bigger than herself. She had loved waking up knowing that the day could bring anything, that her skills and courage would be tested, that she would be part of moments that would define other people's lives. Daniel nodded slowly and, then said something that demonstrated maturity beyond his 18 years. He said that perhaps it was time for her to stop running away from it and start figuring out a way to live with it. That she didn't have to go back to being a firefighter if she didn't want to, but that completely denying that part of herself didn't seem to be working as well as she had hoped. Her son's words echoed in Maria for the rest of the day. She cleaned the house, shopped, prepared dinner, but her mind kept returning to that conversation. Daniel was right. She had spent 3 years trying to be a completely different person. But that woman who had entered a burning building to save strangers was still inside her. That woman who had trained for years, who had developed specific skills, who had sworn to serve and protect, hadn't disappeared just because Maria had moved to another city and traded her uniform for office clothes. That night, after Daniel left to meet friends, Maria finally made the call. Her hand trembled slightly as she dialed, but she didn't hang up this time. The phone rang 3 times before Morrison answered. His voice sounded surprised, but genuinely happy to recognize her. He said he wasn't sure if she would call, but he was hoping she would. They talked for almost 2 hours. Morrison explained that after the Franklin Street fire, he had become obsessed with understanding exactly what had happened. The official investigation had been concluded. Responsibilities, mainly attributed to failures in the warehouse's electrical system and inadequate maintenance. But Morrison always knew there was more to the story, especially when he began interviewing survivors and repeatedly heard about a female firefighter who had continued helping even after the evacuation order. He had tried to identify her through official record, but discovered that Maria had left the corporation before he could ask the right questions. He had tried to locate her, but she had moved without leaving any contact information. Over time, it became a mystery that bothered him, a missing piece in a puzzle he needed to complete. Not for official reasons, but for personal ones. Maria listened to all of this with conflicting emotions. Part of her appreciated knowing that her actions had been noticed, that they hadn't simply disappeared into the chaos of that day. But another part of her resisted the idea of being seen as a heroine, of having her actions of that day transformed into something greater than she felt they were. She tried to explain this to Morrison. She said she hadn't gone back into the building out of courage or heroism, but because there were people inside and she had the skills to help them. She hadn't stopped to think about the risks or the orders or the consequences. She had simply acted. And then, when it was all over, when the building collapsed just minutes after she left with the last group, she had collapsed. Not physically, but emotionally. She realized she had been so close to death that her decisions could have resulted in her own death, leaving Daniel without a mother. Morrison remained silent for a long moment after she finished. Then he said something that changed Maria's perspective. He said that courage wasn't the absence of fear or the absence of thought. Courage was doing what needed to be done even when you fully understood the risks, and that letting go when you realized you could no longer do it safely had also required courage. A different kind, but equally valid. The conversation eventually turned to the present. Morrison asked what Maria was doing now, if she was happy, if she had found peace. Maria honestly replied that she was surviving, that she had built a stable life, but that something always seemed to be missing. She hadn't realized how much until that moment in the gym yesterday, when her old instincts awoke and she felt whole again, even if only for a few minutes. Morrison then made an unexpected proposal. He said the local fire department was always looking for instructors for community training programs. It wouldn't be firefighting, not the same intensity or danger, but it would be a way to use her experience and skills. It would be teaching fire prevention, basic first aid, home safety. It would be making a difference without putting herself in situations that had become unbearable for her. Maria didn't answer immediately. The idea was appealing, but also frightening. It would mean reconnecting with that world, even if in a different way. It would mean using the title of firefighter again, even as an ex-firefighter. It would potentially mean having to talk about her experiences, about that day, about everything she had tried to leave behind. But as she considered the proposal, Maria realized Daniel was right. She couldn't keep pretending that part of her life had never happened. She couldn't keep hiding her scars and her tattoo and her story. Maybe there was a way to integrate who she had been with who she was now. to find a balance between the security she needed and the purpose she told Morrison she would think about it, that she needed time to process. He completely understood and said there was no rush, that the offer would remain open. Before they hung up, he mentioned one more thing. He said that some of the men and women she had helped save that day would like to meet her, to thank her personally. There was no pressure, but if she was ever ready, he could facilitate those meetings. After hanging up the phone, Maria sat in silence for a long time. Night had completely fallen and the house was dark, except for the light from the kitchen. She looked at her reflection in the dark window, saw the 42-year-old woman she had become, with a few wrinkles around her eyes and some gray hairs beginning to appear. She also saw, for the first time in a long time, the strength that still resided within her. In the following days, Maria didn't make any definitive decisions, but she began to make small changes. She stopped automatically pulling up her sleeves to cover the tattoo. When a coworker asked about her, Maria briefly mentioned that she had been a firefighter in Chicago. The coworker was impressed and asked several questions. Maria answered some, dodged others, but didn't feel that familiar tightness in her chest that usually accompanied any mention of those years. Daniel noticed the change in his mother as well. She seemed more present somehow, less like she was just going through the motions of daily life. He didn't say anything initially, but one night during dinner, he mentioned that he had researched the Franklin Street fire. Maria tensed for a moment, but then relaxed. It was only right that he knew, that he understood where she was coming from. They talked about that day in a way Maria had never talked to anyone before. She described arriving at the scene, the intense heat, the black smoke that made it almost impossible to see. She described the decisions she had to make in seconds, like choosing who to try to save first when there were people in multiple locations. She described the moment she heard the structure beginning to collapse and knew she only had minutes left. Daniel listened to everything, asking occasional questions, but mostly just giving his mother space to speak. When she finished, he said something simple but profound. He said he understood now why she had left, but also understood why it still mattered so much, and that whatever decision she made about the future, he would support her. That support meant more to Maria than she could express. For 3 years, she had carried a silent guilt about leaving her firefighting, as if it were a weakness or a failure. But perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps it was simply recognizing human limitations, acknowledging that even the strongest people have breaking points, and that reaching that point didn't diminish everything that came before. A week after Daniel's graduation, Maria called Morrison again. She said she was interested in learning more about the training opportunities he had mentioned. She wasn't committing to anything yet, but was open to exploring. Morrison was visibly excited, and they arranged a meeting for her to visit the barracks and meet the staff. When Maria drove to the fire station 2 days later, her heart raced at the sight of the bright red trucks, the organized equipment, the uniforms. It was familiar and strange at the same time, like returning to a home you'd left long ago. Morrison greeted her personally and gave her a thorough tour, introducing her to various team members as a Chicago veteran. The reactions were of immediate respect. Firefighters had a camaraderie that transcended cities and states. When they learned about her 10 years of service, about some of the situations she had faced, about the Franklin Street fire, they treated her as an equal, as one of their own. Maria hadn't realized how much she had missed that feeling of belonging until she was surrounded by it again. Morrison explained that the community program involved visits to schools, community centers, and local businesses to teach fire safety and emergency preparedness. Maria could start by simply observing other presentations, learning the format, and gradually take on more responsibility as she felt comfortable. There was no mandatory uniform, no emergency calls, no direct danger. Maria realized she was seriously considering it. It would be a way to use her experience without completely re-entering that world. It would be about helping people, teaching skills that could save lives, making a difference in a sustainable way. And perhaps most importantly, it would be a way to honor those 10 years of her life instead of hiding them. She told Morrison she was interested, that she'd like to try. They would start slowly, just a few dates a month initially. She would keep her current job, at least for now, using this as a test to see how she felt. Morrison immediately agreed to the terms and they shook hands. As Maria drove home that afternoon, she felt different, not healed, not completely at peace, but perhaps on the right path. Perhaps healing wasn't about forgetting or overcoming, but about integrating and moving forward with wisdom gained through pain. She looked at her tattoo, now visible under her, the symbol she had chosen to wear that day. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something that wasn't shame or sadness, but a quiet pride in what that symbol represented.